we cannot have enough eyes in the courtroom to see what actually goes on. As David mentioned, vast majority of cases are decided, certainly in the criminal courts, in pleas. I can remember my first foray in that issue as a young lawyer in Chicago, and the DA, called them state's attorneys at the time, in Chicago they call him state's attorney, and I'm trying to get this plea for a young man, and he says, look, if he pleads today, we'll give him, say, 3 years, but if he goes to trial and he loses, then he's going to get 6 to 9 years. I said naively that that's an abuse of his constitutional rights. You can't make a guy's rights turn on whether or not he wants to exercise them or not. And the guy says to me, the assistant state's attorney, where are you from? And I'm a recent graduate of Bolt Hall at the time at Berkeley, and he says, that's not how we do it here. And he was right. That's not how they did it there. But then when I finally come back to California, and I'm in the DA's office and ultimately criminal defense lawyer, that's exactly how it was done here as well. That a person's constitutional rights can turn on whether they're willing to plead or not. And I have found, I know this is a little bit off target, but David did mention it, one of the most outrageous aspects of this entire criminal justice system is falsely arresting people, or arresting them on bogus charges, getting them in the criminal justice system. They have not the money to pay, and they wind up pleading to a lesser offense, and then they wind up being on probation, and they may get a search clause, and the next time they get stopped or walking down the street, they get searched, or they're taken back to their house and they're searched. They have no more rights, and it can happen in a blink of an eye. I've represented a lot of young men who have been stopped wrongfully. They protested that police activity. Then they wind up being charged with delaying or resisting arrest, and they wind up in the criminal justice system. And they might plead to a diversion to a 415, but they're in the system. And the worst part of that is when a person has no record at all, and they get their name put into the criminal justice system. And I can tell you, I refer to this as a way to create a detour for people. Because once you get into that system and you want to get certain kinds of jobs, whether you have been convicted or not, the agency, particularly the law enforcement agency, will hold that against you. And your effort of being in law enforcement is forever lost. And it can be an innocent thing. And so there are many, many examples like that. And so to the extent that David and others can cast a bright light on it, I know it's challenging, but it should be done. Because these things that are done in chambers or behind closed doors really railroad people and send them off to the penitentiary or to prison or to probation when they shouldn't be, and ultimately ruins their lives in ways that is unimaginable. But for me, I see it because I'm often asking young people or anybody, what kind of record do you have? And some people will say, whatever it was, it happened 10 years ago, and so what? Well, it does matter, and people don't, and I'll tell you why it matters, even in the subject, and I'm a little bit moving ahead of myself. But all of you have seen in a police shooting that the first thing that comes out of the public media by the police is the criminal record that a person has. And that effort is designed to make you not care about that person. So when young people get these criminal records that may not be justified, and just listen to Maurice's story, I'm sure he can relate to what I'm talking about. So it is important. Now let me say, I know this was sort of, and I just gave an interview around this, Black Lives Matters. I just want to let everyone know that given where we are, it is extraordinarily important, and maybe more important than I can emphasize, the need to have community groups like Black Lives Matters, other community groups, to participate in bringing to the attention of the public officials their concerns about these issues. Because nobody can move a public official more so than protest and the possibility they may get voted out of office. And the more attention you can bring on it by different groups, the better off we are in terms of moving the social agenda. And we've seen that happen in some of the cases I've been involved in some of the cities that I've been involved in. So let me just start in talking. Police shootings are certainly the centerpiece and the most damaging of all aspects of police abuse. But my practice has, over the 30-odd years or plus years, I asked my wife how many years has it been, sweetheart, but it's been a while. It's been a while. My wife's a law professor, and so she has to listen to all my stories on a day in, day out basis when she's here. But I've been involved in over 1,000 cases, if you can imagine that. That's 1,000 people I have represented down through the years who've been the victim of some form of police abuse. And that runs the gamut, whether it's detentions or arrests or tasers, billy clubs, beatings in jails, youth suicide, sexual assault, sexual harassment, abuse, you name it. I've been involved in these kinds of cases. And I'm always struck by the pain that people suffer as a consequence of it. The pain is deep-seated because, notwithstanding anything else, people want to believe in the police. They want to believe that the police operate under the motto of protect and serve. And when that doesn't happen, it's hard, for them to accept. I wrote a book a number of years ago called Blue versus Black, Let's End the Conflict Between Cops and Minorities. And one of the things but before that title, St. Martin's, the publisher, changed that title. But the title that I had initially was When Grown Men Cry. And it happened, that title came about as a case that I had, where a man, Robert Davis, was in fact abused by the police in the presence of his young daughters. And as he was on the stand and I'm examining him and he's telling the story, he just began to cry. And he cried uncontrollably, and part of it was because it was remembering the look in his daughter's eyes, young girls. And you can imagine, all of us dads know what daughters mean to their dads. And when he thought about it, he just cried. He couldn't fathom how he could be treated that way. And he was a decent working class guy. He was a maintenance man at a local school, and everybody loved him. But the pain that he was suffering in recalling that was immense, and it was deep-seated, and it was hurtful to me to hear that. And so I appreciate what it means to people and the empathy that I have for them when they feel that they've been abused. And even in minor situations, most recently I had 2 young men from up north, Reading somewhere, who were traveling to Oakland, to Vallejo, to see a football game with their cousin. They stopped in Sacramento to get some food. They're followed as they entered Sacramento by 2 local police. They followed the young man into Denny's restaurant, and the young man then, one said, well, why are you messing with us? Words to that effect. And they used a little more profanity, stronger words than that. And the cop says, it's my business to mess with you. And so one thing led to another. That young man wound up getting arrested and sent to jail for resisting arrest, delaying a police officer. The other kids got handcuffed. There was 3 of them. And that was minor. Stop. That happens routinely. And so part of the work is dealing with those kinds of issues that I deal with on a routine basis. Now, police brutality and police shootings are not new to us. If you look back in history at many of the significant riots that have taken place in this country, back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, They have been as a consequence of the police interaction with the African American community and the outrageous circumstances that triggered a protest by the local community. And so I sort of stepped onto this stage of police shootings as a young lawyer back in 1979. I had just left the DA's office, and I'd started to practice with one of the names you might know, Elihu Harris, who was the mayor of Oakland, but he was an assemblyman up here for many, many years. And he and I and another fraternity friend of mine started to practice. But within a short day, within maybe 15 days of that, I remember it very clearly because it was St. Patrick's Day in 1979. And I was on my way to an event in San Francisco when a radio broadcast came out on the news that the police were trying to find someone who was shooting a pellet gun projectiles off of the freeway down as cars were passing. Didn't think much about it. I was looking to see where I was, of course, to make sure it wasn't me that was in the process. But anyway, later that night, what happened is that the police did come upon a 14-year-old African-American boy who was standing by a car, sitting on a car. They suspected he was the person, and he did have a pellet gun. He takes and when the police came, he decides to run. He leaves the pellet gun on the car. He's running away. The police give chase. They claim that he had turned and pointed this gun at him, and they shot him. They shot him 8 times in the back. Well, it was horrific. And a lot of the protests that you hear now, that's the kind of protest that took place then. There was no camera. And so I, surprisingly, at the time, was hired by the city of Oakland. The mayor and the city council hired me to conduct an independent investigation into this shooting. I was in private practice at the time, but I did. And over a 4 or 5 month period, I did this investigation. I hired a renowned private investigator by the name of Hal Lipset. And at the conclusion, to everyone's great surprise, I determined that shooting was unjustified and that the cops had acted improperly. And it sort of put me in the path that I've ultimately happened, but it also was pretty shocking, the results to the various public officials, because the local district attorney, of course, the city attorney's office, the police department, and the U.S. attorney's office had all determined that the shooting was justified. And there I was, this singular person who at the time was 33 years old, making this decision. And it really set in motion my thinking that you really can't trust the official position that's given in police cases, because everything that was done by everyone there was they had put forth a narrative to justify that shooting. And now what came out of that case, of course, what very positive things happened, because a citizen review board resulted from it, and that also let me know that cases can have the opportunity to improve the social conditions at the time. That case allowed for and caused the Citizen Review Board to happen, and that came about because the community was so outraged by the shooting that they took action. And part of that action was the creation of a Citizen Review Board that has stood for many, many years, and one of which is being modified now because of a new thing, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. So that was really a major foray for me in terms of an eye-opener. But then the next step along the way, of course, I was engaged in a private practice, and I had many, many cases during that period of time. But the next case that really kind of opened everyone's, vast majority of people's eyes about police brutality issues was the Rodney King case. And that case, to me, is the singularly most significant case in exposing what level of brutality can occur in cases. It wasn't a shooting case, but it was a brutal beating. Many of you, I'm sure, saw it. It was played over and over and over again. I happened to get involved in that case as a civil attorney, but the most important thing to me was the way the general public resisted the conclusion that this was the officer's brutal conduct, as opposed to a justification for that conduct. And I was in the news a lot during that period of time, and in many interviews, radio stations, public TV, it was the unwillingness of people to accept that this conduct was occurring and that it was not justified. It was always a willingness to say he brought it upon himself, that Rodney King caused it, and that he got what was entitled, that he deserved. And that was a difficult concept, but notwithstanding, there was the video. And if you had your open mind and you were willing to watch that video, you could say, I don't care what he did before. What caused this? The beating itself should not have happened. Human beings should not be treated this way. And the police should not have done what they did. And the worst part of that, there was a sergeant on the scene, Sergeant Stacy Coons, who I had an opportunity and the great pleasure to cross-examine in trial. It was a wonderful period of time. It was like the OK Corral. We were like two warriors going head to head. But the important part is that he never could have conceded and accept the fact that he controlled that situation. Because the other two officers on the scene, particularly Timothy Wynn, if you know the name, was just a young officer, and he kept looking back, what should I do? And he'd say, hit him, hit him, hit him. And as a consequence of that, Stacy Coon was in charge of that. The other officer, Powell, was just a lousy redneck guy who was involved in the racial epithets that were frequently said about monkeys in the mist and things like that. You may have heard over time, we had this recent case here in Sacramento where you heard the words being said, but in LA at the time, there were much more racially derogatory comments that were being made. And it was commonplace, because we got a lot of that information during discovery. And so there appeared to be a deep-seated belief and attitude within LAPD that this was kind of a race, this is the way we do it, this is how we did it. These people were monkeys in the mist, if you will, that they were inhuman, subhuman. And that's how it was treated at the time. But what Rodney King did was let all of us see how officers could be treated. And out of that came up a commission, the Christopher Commission, if you might remember, that sought to deal with the LAPD and some of the issues of police brutality. It was not totally successful at the time. But yet, from then on, that was in the early 90s, I continued to do cases, and then the next big case that happened where police shooting took place that I think also opened the eyes of the general population, and that was the Oscar Grant case. Oscar Grant, this happened in 2008, the night of New Year's night, 2009, on the BART station in Oakland. And Oscar Grant and his buddies and girlfriends were out coming back from San Francisco on New Year's Eve. And a fight breaks out on the train. The train gets stopped. I don't know if you understand what a crushed train means, but it means that people were so jam-packed in that train they could not move. They were crushed. And so two of the officers, when the train stopped at the Fruitvale station, and Oscar and his friends got out. And they got out, an officer, Peroni, and seeks to corral them and hold them to detain them. There's a real question about whether that was proper or not, and I did sue them later and determined it wasn't proper, but that's not the real story that I'm concerned about here, is because what then happened as he's corralling them, one thing leads to another. They have Oscar Grant down on the ground, two officers, two big officers now. One officer is 6'4" and 260, the other guy is 6'4", 6'5", and he may be 260. And they have Oscar Grant pinned down on the ground. And you may have seen the videos of this. If you've seen the movie, it's just chilling to see this. But in any event, the train is stopped. in both directions has stopped. They're crushed. People are watching this, and all of a sudden they pull out their phones, and it was like a movie. Click, 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 like a press conference. Da, 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 da. And what happened there is Oscar's down. He's on his stomach. They're putting his hands behind his back. They got his hands behind their back, and just as they get him behind their back, one of the officers stood up, pulled out his gun, and shoots Oscar in the back, killing him. It was shocking. It was so shocking to all the people who were there, because they all saw it, people taking photos, that people were just crying and crying. And these, a lot of young people, and they were really horrified for what they had seen. And in fact, when the funeral took place several days later, all these people from the train came to the funeral. And it was an event that everyone could see, and obviously went out national, it went viral. And there ultimately came some real questions about the officer's motives and all of that, and we had to litigate those issues, because ultimately the officer claimed that it was unintentional, that he really meant to pull out his taser, but he pulled out his gun. I really disputed that, because, to be honest with you, that story was not told until after he got a new lawyer. The night it happened, and this is told true, that as soon as he shot him, he turned to the other officer and he said, "I thought he had a gun." And for 5 days he maintained that. He never said that I mistakenly pulled my gun instead of my taser. It was only after he got another lawyer, and I won't mention his name, the story changed. And that became the narrative. And that narrative was stated, and ultimately the case stands for the proposition, aside from the legal component of it, is what a community can do. Because in that case, the community was so outraged that the political people were outraged, all the various communities there, we had marches to the DA's office. It was organic the way it happened. And ultimately the DA responded to that and filed murder charges against the officer. And it was a huge deal, and ultimately the case was transferred to Los Angeles because of the publicity, and the officer was convicted of involuntary manslaughter. For me, though, what was important was the community's involvement. I mean, I was doing the civil case. I mean, I could do the civil case, and, you know, I didn't need the community involvement, but I wanted the family to be emboldened and the community to be emboldened that they could do something about this, and they did. And ultimately, as a case of what reform can take place, as I often try to work through, is that as a consequence of this case, we did sue them, and there was this whole question of the use of force program that they had, the manual. So that gets revised. All the officers got retrained on the taser, and the real question on the taser was this: you have whatever hand you have your gun on, whether you're right-handed or left-handed, you have your gun on your strong hand. The taser is supposed to be on the other side and to be in a cross draw. And every officer had to be trained on that, because there had been cases in the country where an officer had mistakenly pulled, at least they claimed they had mistakenly pulled their taser, and and that became a legal issue that had to be fought. But as a consequence of the case, then everybody had to be trained on it. And I was involved with a federal officer, and he told me that in his agency, everybody had to be retrained to make sure that they understood that the taser and the cross from their gun hand, and it's in a cross draw to keep from making a mistake. Whether that was true or not, the point is, from the after fact, that there was training around that. And secondly, the department decided to submit to an outside agency to review the department from top to bottom, which they did, and made a number of recommendations, over 100 recommendations on how to improve the department, and they did. And so that was a very positive thing, and they also got a citizen review board. I think the legislature had to adopt it, but It also caused, spurred, if you will, sort of the Oscar Grant Foundation, which has had to develop a whole other life to help other people, other families, as a support group in getting through it. So the case itself had legs, but at the end of the day, we had a young man who was dead. And he was 23 years old, something like that. He was 23 years old, and his life was snuffed out like that. But it did have, the community itself really rallied around it, and I thought was very, very important. The next case, although it's not a police shooting case, but it has the earmarkings of a police shooting case, and all of you know, because in terms of its impact, its national impact, and that's the Trayvon Martin case. Trayvon Martin, you know, is shot by this wannabe cop guy, and the thing that was most significant out of that case is that that case has the earmarks of a classic racial profiling, and that I often talk about, and it's a huge issue with me, and because I understand that if a person can be targeted and stopped because of their race, bad things can happen to them, and not that it's planned, but organically it can happen. And Trayvon Martin is a classic example of a kid who went to the store to get Skittles, and he's coming back, and some other guy thinks he doesn't belong in the neighborhood. And next thing you know, there's a confrontation, and he gets killed out of that. Now, one could argue that both sides could have been more reasonable, but that's in all cases. In most cases I have that people can be more reasonable, the police could be more reasonable, and they would not happen. You know, unless, you know, you're chasing somebody down in a robbery or murder or something, but generally. And so Trayvon's case really offered up this whole question of what racial profiling can looks like. And it comes out in a case that, to me, raises real questions about what the system can do. And the point is, this was a criminal trial for that office, this person later. And what came out of that case, he was found not guilty. Now, there's a whole question about stand your grounds in that case, although it wasn't argued that way. And one could argue about whether the case was tried properly. But what I most take away from that case is that the criminal justice system does not necessarily provide the relief for the community that think it can. Because that's very much like you take the case to a jury, the prosecutor puts on the case, but there are elements out in the community that will reject cases, and it could be on racial grounds or not. And so Trayvon Martin, to me, meant that whole system did not work for that. And I'll tell you, after Trayvon Martin the young man was found not guilty, I have a nephew on the East Coast who was Trayvon Martin's age, or maybe a little older. He calls me up and he says, Uncle John, he says, what about me? Can this happen to me? And, you know, I was struck by this. And I said, well, I'll tell you this. Yes, it could, but it's more likely to happen to you by gangsters in the street than the police. It can happen, but you've got to be mindful of where you are at all times, because there are different kind of forces out there that could take you down. But I wanted him to understand that as a young African-American male, that he could be the victim of racial profiling. And we all talk about that and what that means, and making sure that you are protected and understanding what your rights are and where you are in exercising those rights. I've had cases where people have been shot and killed by the police for far less, you know, and there's always some argument about, did they reach for a gun, did they reach for the pants, or did they reach for a hand in their waist, or hand in their back pocket, and I always say, look, you can't come to me and tell me that an African-American male of any age is going to reach to his waist with officers with guns in front of them, and as if they're going to engage in a shootout when they have nothing in their waist. That is, I mean, stupid. And people say things like that as a justification. Unfortunately, it's the kind of thing that a DA will believe. that he was reaching for something, that his hand was in his waist, because officers are taught that you got to have an explanation when you use deadly force. And you can always use I was fear of my life. The person reached for his waist, and he was waiting for the district attorney's office. The next major case, and it's a national case, but I think it's instructive because, again, it brings what the community can do and the government can do. And that's in the Mike Brown case out of Ferguson. I don't need to go through all the facts in the shooting of it, but what's important to me was the outrage that it caused. It caused an explosion in that community, and I certainly saw that in the Oscar Grant case. It was just that people just exploded when they could see it. Now, Oscar Grant, we had a video. Mike Brown, there was no video. But there was all these statements. It also shows how things can get out of hand with the misinformation, the wrong information, because there's no question that part of Mike Brown's issue was the statement that he allegedly made about hands up, don't shoot. Anybody hearing that statement would be outraged by it. Now, it turns out that didn't happen, given what was said, but it also highlighted what was wrong in that community. That the constant, it was like, yeah, this case was symbolic of the abuse that was taking place in the community by the police. It was and this is a town where traffic stops were being made just for the purpose of increasing the revenue for the town. And it turns out that this is a town with relatively low economic status, that the poor people in the town were the ones that were providing the revenue to run the city government. But what the case demonstrated was that it reflected the community outrage that can occur in any place where there's a police shooting. And there's been this sense of suppression of rights and a consistent sense that people have been abused, and a case can set off that kind of explosion within the community. And that happened certainly in the Mike Brown case. It also did and it brought forth the DOJ, Department of Justice, in to look at it and found a lot of different kinds of abuses that were taking place. And since then, there have been a number of other cases. And the national cases, I was just interviewed the other day on a case down in L.A., Ezell Ford. Ezell Ford was a mentally impaired person who was not homeless but impaired. Two police officers who were gang officers, and they knew Ezell, who was known in the community. He was not a gang member, but they decided to stop him and just see what's going on with him. He was just walking. Ultimately, one thing led to another because he kept saying I hadn't done anything, and ultimately they shot and killed this man. And the DA just recently said that they were not going to prosecute. I had another case. I had a case up here in Sacramento, and I refer to it as my middle-age Trayvon Martin case. This man was after a Super Bowl game. I thought about it because the Super Bowl was tomorrow. After a Super Bowl game several years ago, he leaves his house to go to buy chips and drinks, go back to the party with. He goes. Unbeknownst to him, there had been a burglary that had taken place somewhere in that part of town. Young African-American male. My guy was middle-aged. He was in his 40s. And the police were looking for this guy. He's breaking in cars. Both the Sacramento PD and the Sacramento Sheriff Department were looking for him, looking for the burglar. Sacramento Police Department officers found the guy. He's arrested. He's in their car. The Sacramento Sheriff people, they hear about it, but they see my man, this other man, walking from the store. They decide to see what's up. What are you doing out here, right? They stop him. He says to them, why are you stopping me? I haven't done anything. They try to tell him to stay here. He says no. He turns to walk away, They tase him, but he has a thick jacket on. It doesn't stick. He then keeps going. He gets shot and killed. Shot and killed. He was just going to the store. And he hadn't committed no crime. And so that's the kind of example that can infuriate you when you think about the abuse of law enforcement. And sure, they had the explanations, they had all that. Now, my guy did not have a good record, so therefore they were able to demonize him, to say that he had a bad record as a way to not for you to care about him. And we fought that case all the way, and we ultimately settled that case for that particular case was significant. But it was an example of what can happen. And all of you are aware of the other national cases, the Tamir Rice and the 12-year-old and Laquan McDonald. Some of these cases that have videos really have struck at the heart of what the challenge that we are facing when we look at police shootings. I don't know if I said it, but I've had over 50 police shootings that I can count. I started doing them a long time. But when I look at my records, I asked my staff the other day, of all of our cases, it's well over 50, all throughout the state, that we're working on, I should say, have worked on, many of which are completed down through the years. But we still are looking at this. Now, if you look at the totality of what we're talking about here, surprisingly, there has not been a database that chronicles the number of police-related shooting deaths in the country. That's hard to believe. At least it was hard for me to believe, particularly when we know that the Department of Justice keeps statistics on all police shooting that results in an officer being killed. They can give you that information with a push of a button. But they cannot, and did not have, I could not now, but certainly have not until very recently, we could gather that information. So what has happened, that the Washington Post and the Guardian newspapers in 2015, they decided to see what they could do in identifying all the police-related shooting deaths that have happened in the country. And they found out in 2015, 2014, 2 years in a row was about 1,000. And then 2016, 2016 2015 and 2016 it was 1,000. Just about the same each year. And I say all that to say that there's cameras. So cameras in and of themselves didn't stop police shootings from taking place, but the cameras still occurred. The shootings took place. Now the Department of Justice under Attorney General Loretta Lynch then decided in 2016 that the Department of Justice itself was going to start collecting this data. And so they're starting to do it, and the Department of Justice, no question about it, is trying to make that gather good data. Because I think at the end of the day, everyone concedes that it's what data allows you to make good decisions in terms of new approaches to identify the problem that you can, and getting that data really brings it home. But part of what the data shows so far, that in 2015 and 2016, black people were killed by the police at more than twice the rate of white people in both 2015 and 2016. Young black men were 9 times more likely to be killed by the police, according to The Guardian. And about 1/4 of the deaths, mental illness was considered a factor. 1 in 65 deaths of young black men is at the hands of the police. In about 1/4 of the fatal shooting, the subject was fleeing. About 25% of African Americans killed by the police were unarmed, compared to about 17% for whites. Body cameras captured about 6% of the fatal shootings, and as I said earlier, about 1/4 of the deaths where mental illness was a problem. You know, the mental illness question to me is one of the most significant aspects. If we can do something about reducing police shootings, it's in the area of how we deal with the mentally impaired. How we deal with them. I've had a number of cases where the police have been called to the house. I have one pending in Sacramento. I've been on the Ninth Circuit for 2 years now. Police are called to the house because a family member is acting mentally in a disturbing way, bizarre, having a psychotic break or whatever it is. And they really want help. You know, help my loved one. It invariably happens in many of these cases that the police kill the person. And to me it is most shocking because the police go there with a law enforcement felony mentality. And they wind up using force. They create a confrontation and they kill people. A report by the Rudderman Foundation, a disability organization, found that almost half of those who have lost their lives at the hand of law enforcement at some point had some kind of emotional disability. It's no secret that one of the issues related to the Joseph Mann's case here in Sacramento, and another one of my cases in San Francisco, Mario Woods, who I believe his mom is back there, has some kind of health crisis, mental, emotional impairment at the time. And I believe that each one of those incidents could have been resolved. Could have been resolved if the officers had been more in tune on how to de-escalate a situation with a mentally impaired person than not. I tried a case in San Jose 2 years ago. I had a young man who was laboring under an emotional, mental disability, who was suicidal. And interestingly enough, he had a knife that he had to his neck, but a next door neighbor, a female retired African American cop, saw him and she starts talking to him. He's listening and she just keeps talking, trying to find out what the problem was in a calm way. A police officer arrives on the scene, jumps out of her car, runs over, tells the lady to get back, pulls out her gun, and takes control. Within moments, she shoots this man, injuring him, shooting him in the back. He's now a paraplegic. Terrible case. You know, there is this view that professionals have said, and some of the research is taking place, that police need to rethink how they deal with the mentally impaired. There was an article in the New York Times by Chuck Wessler and Scott Thompson, the chief of police of the Camden, New Jersey Police Department. They wrote an article talking about the training that officers need to go through, particularly in dealing with those with edge weapons. And I say that because edge weapons, a knife, is almost routinely dealt with by shooting the person. And they claim, and I've had this in cases so I know this very well, that there's this 21-foot rule, meaning that an officer can pull his gun out, that a person can cover 21 feet before an officer can pull his gun out, pull it, fire, and shoot. Well, most of the cases I have, the officer already has his gun out. They don't need to worry about the 21 feet because a person can't get within 2 feet because they have the gun already out. And so the 21-foot rule has been discredited in law enforcement. And it's often used as a way to describe it, to justify what officers can or cannot do. But there's this view now that the best approach is one of de-escalation. That de-escalation is one of using a calming voice. It is using somebody perhaps from what they call certified institute training, certified intervention training, that allows for a person who's laboring under mental disability to be talked to slow it down. Because generally you have time. And most professional officers who engage in this understand that you can diffuse a person and calm that person down. That if they're suicidal or if they're acting bizarre, that take the time. We had a case 2 years ago that went to the United States Supreme Court that involved a mentally impaired woman who was shot by San Francisco police officers. And part of the problem was that it was our view that under the ADA, because they knew she was mentally impaired, she was a developmentally disabled person, that under the ADA that you are supposed to make reasonable accommodations for that person. And the argument in the case was, if it was a police situation, do you have to make reasonable accommodations? That case with the United States Supreme Court, we were unsuccessful on the issue of qualified immunity, which was not the issue for us anyway. The issue was that whether or not the ADA applied to police officers. And ultimately, it does, and it has, and which means that a police officer, if is aware of a person's mental disability, if the opportunity presents itself, reasonable accommodation should be made, which means that you should, if you have the time, to take the time to get help, to calm the situation down, and hopefully from there you can prevent a shooting from taking place, or a shooting or a death from taking place. And there are examples that some of the research people know. And I remember last year, Sweden, law enforcement from Sweden and from Scotland and from London, Scotland Yard, I guess it is, they had a chance to meet with a number of police law enforcement folks from the United States. And it was about how to disarm people with edge weapons. Now, in England and London, they don't have guns, you know. And in Sweden, if they have them, they're not used that often. But they told them how to. Told them how to defuse the situation. Now, the American police officers were reluctant. They said, "Well, you don't have the kind of fear danger that we have." And the other men said, the other law enforcement said, "Look, there's techniques to be employed here that you can, in fact, cut down, reduce the tension, not engage in force if you are willing to take the time." This is a retraining question that has to take place, and there are some departments that are engaging in that. Certainly in our San Francisco case with Mario Woods, after the case, then there was a decision to modify their mental health training, and they put together a pretty good program. And as a consequence of our efforts in another case, a department in the East Bay, they've identified and revised their particular approach. Another defense lawyer whom I've dealt with a lot of cases, he has begun instructing police officers on how to diffuse situations in dealing with mentally impaired. So there are changes occurring that it's really a function of a willingness to do so. I believe the Sacramento police officers knew what to do. 2 of them did. But the other 2 who did the shooting did not, made no effort. They were renegade officers in that sense. But the other 2 people did. They were following this guy, Joseph Mann, following him slowly in a car. But the other 2 officers came in abruptly. Now these guys had sordid records. But they're the ones that became cowboys and ultimately created a confrontation and killed Joseph Mann. Joseph Mann should not be dead. And it's very hurtful to me to see something like that having occurred. Regardless of what his condition was in life,